Hi, my name's Anna Serin. I'm Director of Listings Development with the Canadian Securities Exchange, and you are joining us for another weekly market update. I am joined by my co-host, Bruce Campbell with StoneCastle Investment Management. Thank you for joining us, Bruce.
Yeah, glad to be here. Lots going on this week in the markets for sure.
It was a busy week, so we have a lot to unpack. We'll jump right into it. We're going to start off by talking about the $1.9 trillion stimulus package that happened in the US. We're going to talk about a surge in Bitcoin prices and what that means. We're going to retouch on the sector rotation that we talked about a little bit last week. And there was a bunch of movement in the cannabis space. So lots to talk about. Let's start with the US stimulus package.
Yeah, obviously record stimulus package, 1.9 trillion. Sounds like there could be checks going out to people as early as this week, or this weekend, I guess. So, obviously that's driving, or that will drive markets if it hasn't already. Probably has had some impact on maybe Bitcoin, but certainly in some of the online trading, there was lots of talk that the stimulus checks from some prior packages, made their way to the Robinhood style trading accounts, and that people who didn't necessarily need those stimulus packages or stimulus checks were trading online. So that certainly probably finds its way into the market in some way. Hopefully, it finds its way into the economy because that's really what they're looking for. But it's certainly interesting how that'll affect the markets going forward here.
Yeah, so I mean, it could be a good thing, I guess, in the short term for the markets. But what happens when a country just prints money like this?
Well, I mean, obviously that's sort of the experiment that we haven't really seen in this magnitude ever before. There's been some concern, obviously, in the previous weeks about inflation, and obviously with all the stimulus and money that the government's printing, that obviously always becomes a concern. What happens to the dollar? What happens to its purchasing power? And you've seen that a little bit already with rates. You've also seen the US dollar's been in a downtrend now. It's, had a bit of a counter trend bump here just in the real short term, but it's been in a downtrend now for the last year as, they continue to roll out more stimulus. And I suspect that that's going to continue to be the case because, they are certainly printing money at a lot faster rate than ever before.
Well, and I don't know if you can deny the fact that they keep printing more money. And as the news release of this stimulus package comes out, Bitcoin has a crazy surge where, they've capped it as far as there's no more Bitcoin being created, right? I mean, there must be some correlation there.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, hard assets, of which, you kind of have to consider Bitcoin one of those, have all had, fairly significant moves with the exception of probably gold. Which is shocking and surprising to a lot of people. But yeah, Bitcoin for sure, it's kind of the new wave, sort of new form of reserve currency that's not a currency, not a fiat currency. And so, people are necessarily buying gold right now, but they're certainly looking at Bitcoin. The fact that, there's a fixed number that will be mined and the fixed number over a lifetime, obviously that has a real impact and a real draw to some people for sure.
I wonder how many of those checks that go out to families are just going right into Bitcoin. That'll be interesting to see. I was reminded actually that in Vancouver, there was a coffee house in Vancouver that had one of the original ATM machines for Bitcoin. And at the time it was $700. I think I just checked today and it's currently over 71,000 Canadian dollars per Bitcoin. Wish I had bought one at that time. But I did not. Okay, so let's talk about sector rotation. We touched on this last week. What are you seeing?
Yeah, well, obviously we continue to see this transpire again this week. We've seen, a little bit of bounce back or snap back in some of the sectors that got really oversold last week, which is technology. We saw a bit of that, a couple of times this week. We saw it, on Tuesday and on Thursday when, those sectors really started to come back. And I mean, I think that's a function of, so that rubber band being stretched so far. There was, an awful lot of selling last week, and it really turned into sort of indiscriminate selling at the end of last week. And so not surprising to see some of those sectors bounce back, but we are seeing, kind of more leadership in, in the financials, in the energy. Now we're starting to see some of the industrials, including, in Canada here, we've even seen the airlines moving, and, they're a long ways off their bottom. But they've also had a fairly significant move here just in the last, kind of 2 weeks, which is interesting. That's obviously people looking out to, what the recovery looks like, and the fact that, there's probably going to be pent up demand for airline travel, and at the same time, there's not the capacity that there once was because they've all pulled capacity out of the system, and so it should be probably fairly strong for earnings of airlines once they get back going.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, they obviously have depressed support levels right now. So they might not only recover, but I think people will be looking at, everyone's going to be looking at a way to get back out of the house and go enjoy life again. And hopefully that'll be a good stimulus enough for Canadians anyway. I don't see any stimulus package coming our way quite that big. There was a lot of movement in the cannabis space. Let's talk about cannabis. There's a bunch of different things I want to talk about. Cannabis obviously has been trucking along as we go through the pandemic. I think it saw some great support levels when it was recognized as an essential service in a lot of countries where it has a legal jurisdiction. And I think that gave it kind of a bit of a props up. We're seeing another wave. We're seeing some big MSOs. We're really starting to see the institutions come into play. And then, of course, this week, there was some which added the fuel to that fire. There was a bunch more stuff that happened. So let's talk about the big one of note, and that is the British American Tobacco Company invested in a Canadian cannabis company. Tell us about it.
Yeah, so they took just under 20%, 19.99% ownership in Organigram out of New Brunswick, which is kind of interesting in itself. That they're not. Organigram is a great operator, but they haven't traditionally been thought of as one of the kind of bigger ones. And they've taken an ownership position in Organigram, which is interesting. I mean, obviously we've seen other moves from alcohol and tobacco in the past, so that's a fairly significant move. And then the other significant move this week was Curaleaf out of the U.S. They actually invested in a European cannabis company, and so that's interesting. They're looking at the market and saying it's basically down the road is double the size of the U.S. market, and there's opportunity there. And the investors are always looking to kind of where the puck's going, not where it is. And it was Canada, then it became the U.S., and maybe this is the next trend that we'll see, along with perhaps Mexico, which also this week moved through the process of becoming legal recreational cannabis, which would be the largest country in the world if they once they sort of get that finalized. But it looks like it's just in the president's hand now to get signed off on. So, which was quite interesting. And then the last little tidbit I'll throw out there was, I was doing a call with a California cannabis company this week, and one of the things that they brought up was the vaccine, and they said it's quite interesting how cannabis has really pivoted in the last couple of years. And now if you are in California, the people who are eligible for the vaccine are people who are over 65, who are essential healthcare workers, and if you're in the cannabis sector. So it's hard to believe that you could be a 20-year-old or a 25-year-old in the cannabis sector in California, and I'm assuming that you show your right ID and you'll get a vaccine right now, which is quite interesting.
Why is that?
Well, I mean, it's an essential service, and I guess someone must have lobbied to the government to have that as a group that needed it, and certainly it's it's a big part of the California economy, and so they're doing that. So quite interesting.
Wow, that is really surprising. The one thing, so you touched on a bunch of different stuff that's happening kind of globally in the cannabis space. One thing I find interesting is, the other one that came out is that Canopy came out with their THC beverage. And I find it interesting, kind of the intertwining of sectors that's happening. One is, I don't think that there's a lot of, for cannabis users, they wouldn't necessarily go, well, we're in the same field as tobacco users. And same with, I know lots of cannabis users don't feel that cannabis and alcohol should be combined. So it's interesting to see this marriage happen between some of the sectors and companies kind of combining together. Do you want to maybe just touch on, I think, one thing that's interesting and why this is the case? British American Tobacco, I looked it up. I mean, they are a behemoth of a company in the tobacco space. They took 19.99% ownership. And can you explain why they do that? What happens at 20?
It comes down to reporting and kind of how they have to sort of make their intention of what they're trying to do versus like passive or an active investment, and whether or not they're trying to make a takeover. So they do that for certain legal reasons, so that they don't have to go through other sort of criteria. And then if they want to, sort of take that next step and buy it out, then it has to be, sort of a formal bid that's done.
Exactly. So it's a block. You become a block shareholder over 20%. And I think it's always interesting when you watch companies do that kind of a purchase, they're wanting some flexibility. They're not, I think it also changes if they wanted to sell any of their ownership. It becomes a much bigger process if you own over 20. So they're definitely still wanting a bit of that flexibility. I did read they're taking 2 boards of the seat. Or 2 seats on the board for Organigram, as well as I think they're combining a lot of their, they have obviously kind of their R&D and they're combining it with Organigram. So it'll be interesting to watch that happen. I'm just a big fan of seeing that kind of money come into a Canadian company. Obviously, I think it was 126 million pounds that was invested. So that's always great for us in Canada in the markets. What do you think is going to happen with the Mexican legalization? I mean, the history of the drug war down in the U.S. in Mexico, and just how it's run by the cartel. How is that going to change things once it gets legalized? Do you think that do you think they have a long road to get there, or do you think that this will happen naturally?
I do. I think it's going to be a long road. Not unlike, the legacy or illegal market, black market in Canada or the US. It's proving to be, more troublesome to get, users to move over to the legal market. A big part of Mexico, though, I would imagine, I haven't seen any stats on this, would be export, though. And so, that could continue to be, sort of what happens, behind closed doors, whereas the legal market could be, more for the Mexican user. It will run into the same issues that it did in Canada and into the US, where, the price point has to come down to where it competes with legal cannabis. And, interestingly enough, I was reading an article this morning on Village Farms, which is a Canadian producer who has greenhouse access in Mexico. And if you remember kind of how they transitioned they went from growing vegetables to growing cannabis in Canada. And the talk was that, they could, have the ability to, maybe ramp up once the time is right in Mexico. And that's what it's going to take is, sort of those bigger operations that are going to be low cost to compete with, the black market, because, when you start adding in taxes and, all the different government regulatory policies that are expensive, it becomes difficult for them to compete initially. But, as the facilities get bigger and get more efficient, then it allows them to compete. So Mexico probably has, a few years before, it really becomes competition. And to begin with, that's not even part of the program. They're just looking at really allowing for you to have cannabis and to grow a small amount at home. And they're laying out the framework for how they would have a legalized industry.
Well, it'll be really interesting to see how it plays out. I mean, my first thought when I was reading up on it was it'll be interesting because there's going to be a whole bunch of new investment opportunities that are going to come to market, right?
There will be. It's going to be doing due diligence and vetting things is going to be really challenging for sure. I mean, there was enough of that in Canada. I can't imagine what it's going to be like in Mexico. But yeah, with it being potentially the largest legalized recreational country in the world, the opportunity could be huge.
Absolutely. The other thing I just wanted to touch on before we wrap up for the week is I wanted to talk about this THC beverage. And I think it's important to talk about it because, if you're a non-cannabis user, you might not understand the impact that it has. I actually had the benefit of doing a panel once, and I'll make sure that we post that up there so people can go check it out because it really broke it down. And I learned a lot from it. The THC beverage is quite interesting. And I'm wondering how well it'll do in the market. It might do quite well because the technology that they had to create to put it into a beverage, first of all, it's not a water soluble product. So they had to work the science around making it water soluble as well. They needed to do a slow release or a quick release. They needed to do it where if you were having a beer, that you feel the impact as you digest the beer, whereas edibles, as most people know, it can take effect much later. So they had to build technology around having this work within your system at the speed that you're drinking it, so that you don't drink it and an hour later feel it. And by then maybe you've consumed too much. So it's really interesting to see that they finally have gotten there and released it into the market. I'm kind of intrigued by this side of the market. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, obviously Constellation came in, a couple of years ago now, or almost, yeah, a little over 2 years ago now, into to Canopy, and obviously they didn't do that to sell flower, I would imagine, and so they see the future there. And like you say, the technology had to really catch up to a delivery method that people are used to, where they can consume it. The onset comes fairly quickly, and then the offset is sort of a similar profile to what you would expect with an alcoholic beverage. And so as a result, that's really what they've been trying to dial in. There's a number of different companies that do this, have different technology, and it has been kind of one of the biggest challenges to try to get that same profile as alcohol, so people are familiar with it and don't overdose when they're out on a sort of casual experience, right?
Absolutely. We have a bunch of companies on the CSE that are in the space. So again, I'm quite intrigued to see how this is going to play out. Bruce, as we wrap up, what should we think about before next week or going into next week?
Well, I mean, some of the interesting things to look at are, obviously the sector rotation we think is still fairly important. And then, tonight we should see TSX rebalancing, which is always interesting for some companies as well next week.
Wonderful. Well, listen, have a wonderful weekend. We will talk to you next week. Looking forward to it.
Okay. Thank you.